You are listening to Chthonia, the podcast of the Dark Feminine. Chthonia's logo was designed by J.R. Malpair. Background music is Phantasm by Kevin MacLeod. Hello and welcome to Chthonia. I'm your host, Breach Burke. This week's topic will be the goddess Persephone. Persephone is known as either Persephone or Proserpina, and sometimes is also referred to as the Kore, and she's mainly known for being queen of the Underworld in ancient Greece. Her spouse is Hades, the rather passive king of the Underworld, and Persephone is connected with a couple of different rites and mysteries. She's associated with the coming, with the seasons, with the coming of winter and spring, in the particular myths associated with her, and of course that's sort of one level of interpretation of looking at Persephone and looking at her, the meaning of her story. Now, Persephone is an interesting figure because, from the perspective of the dark feminine, she, again, very similar to what happened with Medusa, as we talked about in the last episode. There's this sense of the particular story of her abduction by Hades into the underworld. It kind of takes on different inflections over time. And one of the things is that she is, again, in some cases, she is the helpless young girl who's been carried off by this sort of wicked man or wicked uncle, really, in this case, who has, who's forcibly raping her. Okay, it's often referred to as the rape of Persephone or the rape of Proserpina. But the actual original Greek story does tell a slightly different, has a slightly different take on that, of course. And like a lot of these stories in Greek mythology, where you have some horrifically traumatic event like a rape or cannibalism or incest or something like that, one has to be very, very careful about what the meaning of that act is, because as I mentioned, you're dealing with gods. You're not dealing with mortals. You can't apply the same, certainly you can take the point of view. If you're a woman, you can say, well, how terrible it is that she's carried off like that. But there's a couple of other ways to look at this story. So let's get into what the details are. First, let's start with who she is herself. As I mentioned, daughter of, and she's a daughter of the goddess Demeter, who is the goddess of sort of grain and agriculture, similar to Ceres or Kyres in the Roman, which is where you get the word cereal from. She has to do with so her mother, of course, is the one who, she has a mother goddess element. She's the one who makes the earth fertile. And I'm just going to read you a little bit, just a sort of a summary of Persephone and her, and the basic myth that is associated with her. Again, I always refer to Pierre Grimal for these. Okay, Grimal says the goddess of the underworld and wife of Hades is Persephone. She was the daughter of Zeus and Demeter. Okay, so she is fully a goddess. She's not a demigoddess. Although another tradition makes her the daughter of Zeus and Styx. Styx, of course, being the personification of the river that runs through the underworld. Hades fell in love with Persephone, his niece, and abducted her while she was picking flowers on the plain around Etna in Sicily. This abduction occurred with the complicity of Zeus and in the absence of Demeter. Eventually, Zeus ordered Hades to restore Persephone to her mother. But this was no longer possible, for the young girl had eaten a pomegranate seed, which was enough to tie her to the underworld forever. As a compromise, Zeus decided that she should divide her time between the underworld and the world above. As Hades' wife, Persephone plays a part in the legends of Heracles, Orpheus, Theseus, and Pirithous. She was also said to have fallen in love with Adonis. She appears with Demeter in the Eleusinian Mysteries. In Rome, she was identified with Proserpina. Okay, so quite a bit to unpack there. First, let's start with the story. So the question becomes, just looking at my notes here. So the question then becomes, how does, what goes down with this particular abduction story? And for me, I have sort of three different themes that come out of the Persephone story and out of the role that she eventually assumes. First, we have the idea of whether or not she's a rape victim. There's another mythological motif, which I call the bad boy lover motif, for lack of a better term, that is that also is at play here, but that tends to be ignored, and I think that's rather significant. Also, this is sort of a mythological, allegorical configuration of the movement from girlhood to womanhood. Okay. And hence her name Kore, which means young girl, and that's generally a term applied to girls before they are married, like a virginal name. That's very significant here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, particularly about Jung talks about the Kore as an archetype, and it's very, I think it's critical here. And lastly, I would say this eternal return that she makes, because she spends time in the underworld, then she's up and back on the earth with her mother, and then she's back in the underworld. It makes her kind of an ideal figure for the Orphics, who introduced this idea of, really are the first ones in Greece to introduce this idea of, I use the word salvation very loosely here, but the idea that one had some control over their destiny after death. Okay. And in the Orphic myth, she is actually the mother of Dionysus, also known as Zegrus, with Zeus, who's also her father. And the story of Dionysus in the Orphic cosmogony gives Persephone a rather interesting kind of central role. It's like souls are given to her in tribute as payment for the Titans' attempt to destroy her son. But we'll get to that one as well. Okay, so let's start with the what I'm going to call the bad boy lover. I wrote a paper that's actually on academia.edu. It gets a lot of view. It's I refer to it as, it was something I wrote actually in my doctoral program, called 50 Shades of Grey and Pomegranate Seeds. And what it refers to is the idea of the virginal young girl. And I think in particular, I think it started because the idea for this particular piece started when a colleague of mine had talked about how the movie 50 Shades of Grey had grossed something obscene like $90 million or something like that. I forget, maybe I'm exaggerating. But it was a huge amount of money. And he made the comment that he just thought, this is disgusting. This shows the state of the society that we're in. And I'm going, well, wait a minute. Or is it just everybody's kind of in denial of what society actually is, or what human desire and fantasy actually is? Okay. And I of course compare it. I grew up in the 70s, and so of course I'm familiar with a lot of these rock stars and rock legends who are around, who are considered at that time. They have a great mystique to them. Okay, they were very, they're very, very good looking, and kind of strutting it out on stage, whether they were, singers, guitar players, whoever they were, and they are frequently were surrounded by groupies, 12, 13-year-old girls. Up to, it was interesting. I remember reading Pamela DeBar's sort of autobiography, I'm With the Band. And I remember her mentioning in there that by the time a girl got to be 18 in that scene, she was considered to be an old hag. So it's a rather interesting kind of concept, and it's interesting because now people look back. I see articles like the 10 celebrities who were actually monsters, like things like with titles like that, and they're referring to a lot of the rock stars of the 70s. Now maybe some of them were monsters. I don't know. I mean, I've never had sex with any of them. Don't know what it's like. But I do know that I'm very skeptical of the idea of referring to these guys as rapists and monsters who take advantage of young girls, especially when I read the accounts where these girls are like lined up outside their door and practically pulling each other's hair, trying to wanting to be the one to get into the room with them. Okay. Now you may say yes, but that's the problem. There's the idea of it's the young girl, and the young girl, she's innocent and she's chaste, and here's this older man manipulating and corrupting her. And while on the one hand, I look at it and I say, okay, yes, you know what? Young girls don't know anything, and they maybe very easily do stupid things and be taken advantage of. Certainly from a legal perspective, this is why you have laws about age of consent and things like that. From that perspective, I could say, okay, you know what? There's some safety measures in place to keep people from, not that it not necessarily stops people, but to try to keep, teen pregnancy and disease and other disasters, from occurring. Although those laws get to be ridiculous when it's sort of like, okay, you have an 18-year-old guy and a 17-year-old girlfriend, and they get caught, and now he's branded a sex offender for life, which is that's just absolutely stupid. Okay, because because what's consent? Oh, all of a sudden now you're 18, and all of a sudden now your brain suddenly flips, and suddenly now you're an intelligent adult making intelligent decisions. I mean, if you believe in neuroscience, when we talk about brain science, the frontal lobes of the brain aren't even formed, fully formed until you're 23. So you're going to be making stupid decisions at least up until then. And there are people who make stupid decisions their entire life. So it's, I mean, I can include myself in that. I've made some very stupid decisions in my life, especially when it comes to relationships. So, it's, so I don't know. So the whole consent thing is a little sketchy to me. But what does that have to do with Persephone? Well, the original Greek story of Persephone. It was an interesting article I had read in the Classical Quarterly that I make reference to, where, of course, what Persephone has disappeared. Her mother doesn't know what's happened to her. Nobody will tell her. Finally, it's the goddess. It's Helios, the god of the sun, and also Hecate, another underworld goddess, who we will be talking about, are the ones who cue her into what has happened. And when she finds out that Zeus was complicit, then she gets very angry and she makes the earth barren. Okay, she won't allow anything to grow. So this is the reason for the compromise. Okay, so Zeus tries to get Hades to give her back. But see, now she's eaten the fruit of the underworld. Once you eat the fruit of the underworld, you're stuck there, okay? And what she eats are pomegranate seeds, and it depends. Sometimes she only eats one, other times they say she eats 9. It depends on the version, and there could be other numbers too. But what's interesting is that when she's finally reunited with her mother, and her mother finds out that she's eaten the pomegranate seeds, Persephone's, her statement is rather interesting. And it translates to, my husband tricked me into eating them, and now I feel that way towards him. Okay, meaning she's now in love with her husband. Now that's really very interesting because, first of all, you have the idea of the pomegranate seed as kind of an aphrodisiac or love charm. Okay, and pomegranates certainly did, that was considered to be a fruit that increased or sensuality or desire. But also, so it's almost like he's created a love charm to make her fall in love with him. At least that's what Persephone says. And I said, I can't help but reading this story and feel like, you know what, this doesn't sound to me like the poor victim who's been carried off and raped. I mean, she might have been carried off. But this sounds also more like the young girl who, well, on one hand, it could be, because Hades, of course, who would want to be married to the king of the underworld? I mean, in terms of, potential spouses that one could have. Gee, that sounds great. I get to live in the gloomiest palace anywhere in the universe, under the earth. Why would you want to do that? I should also note, by the way, that Hades falls in love with Persephone because Aphrodite, at the beginning of that story, it says Aphrodite decides she's going to extend her kingdom to the underworld. So she has Eros, her son, shoot an arrow at Hades to make him fall in love, and the first girl he sees is Persephone, and this is why he acts as he does. Now, it's interesting, so I look at this whole story, and to me, it almost sounds like, I mean, obviously, it doesn't sound like Persephone knew him beforehand, but it's almost like he's the dangerous, dark man who sweeps the girl off her feet and takes her virginity. You know what I mean? And that in some fashion, she actually kind of likes this, but she can't admit that to her mother, so she was tricked, okay? Now, whenever I say this, there's always people who get very irritated. They think somehow I'm being like a rape apologist or something like that. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Rape occurs when two people are not consenting, okay? I think John Oliver said it best. It's in his thing on sex ed, his little episode on that. He had said it's like boxing. If one of the people involved does not assume that you're in a boxing match, then somebody's doing something illegal. That's the way it is with sex. So then the question then becomes, it becomes a very gray area with girls who may actually have a desire for someone that their parents don't approve of, or that their parents think is dangerous, and you're going to stay away from that one. And we can't swear that this is what's happening with Persephone, but it's rather interesting how she kind of she takes up her role as queen of the underworld. And by the way, she takes up a very active role in the underworld. Hades is very, very passive as a rule. We rarely hear about him asserting himself on anything. The only time you see Hades assert himself is in the story of Theseus and Pirithous, who, of course, come to the underworld because Pirithous wants to abduct Persephone to be his own wife. And when he comes down and they state their intentions, Hades just laughs, tells them to have a seat, and of course then when they're sitting is in the chairs of forgetfulness where they're stuck. And they can't leave until Heracles comes and rescues them. Okay. In the story of Eros and Psyche, Persephone is the one who is sought out by Psyche to retrieve her beauty cream for Aphrodite. And also, Persephone is the one, she's the one who cares for Adonis, and she does fall in love with him. Her and Aphrodite have a disagreement about him. He ends up in kind of a similar conundrum where he spends part of the year in the above world and part of the year below. So, she's, and when you read about her in the Odyssey and in other places, typically what's done is the statement made is that that people, what is Queen, what kind of illusions has Queen Persephone created? Nobody talks about Hades. They talk about Persephone. So she assumes a rather active role as queen of the underworld. Her husband's just very, very passive, which is very it's the reverse of what you would expect in the masculine feminine. You have a passive masculine and you have an active feminine. But of course, this is also the underworld, where things are not quite like they are in the above world. So anyway, I tend to look at the Persephone story not so much as a, this poor innocent young girl who's been carried off. And also this, by the way, this also doesn't imply, there tends to be a thing of woman as temptress or woman as, she's either got to be virginal or she's got to be a whore. And it's kind of like, I really am not happy with either one of those. To me, it's like, why can't you just have desire and want to enjoy sex just like anybody else? Nobody complains when men do it. But when women do it, somehow it's like, oh, well, that's scandalous, or she's this kind of person, or that she's not anything. She's a normal person with normal desires. And I kind of feel that way about, I feel that way about Persephone, but I kind of, I just feel that way when I look at teenage girls. They're kind of at a place where, they are young, they're naive, and frequently they want different things in relationships anyway. I mean, you have men who, a lot of times men are just looking for physical gratification, and women think they're getting into a relationship, okay? There could be a lot of, that's a kind of a whole side discussion as to, what might be behind that, both biologically, in terms of the chakras, what might be behind that, the sexual centers being in different places. But whatever it is, there's definitely that kind of, that sort of disconnect there. And, and then there may also be cases where young women, maybe you're not so comfortable. Where the sexuality is there, but they may not be comfortable with it yet, and they, and really, like I said, it's all a matter of should be a matter of personal choice. So I'm not a big fan of saying that women at that age have no idea what they're doing. In one sense, no, they don't, and in another sense, they know what they want. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because a woman, says something or does something, she may be doing something because that's what she thinks she's supposed to do. It's not necessarily because she wants something. But having lived through that era of life, I do know that desire can be really, really, really strong at that age. It's like you're trying to fight off a tsunami there of hormones and feelings. So, and I suppose these things are there to keep people in check and to keep these things in check. But by the same token, you also have to remember that, I think it comes down to the idea that the girl who's entering womanhood or is newly a woman, also has a will of her own. And to entirely discount that either as she's too naive and doesn't know what she's doing, and in some cases, maybe she knows enough to know that she doesn't want to do that. Okay, it can go either way. But but the idea that she is always the victim of somebody is something that I not necessarily. Sometimes it is something that she chooses, but it's something that her family would not approve of. There's a motif that I do want to talk about in a future episode called the hanging virgins, and I've mentioned them before. It's the motif, and you see this too in these other stories where the young girl falls in love with the dark stranger, who of course turns out to be the devil or somebody. In Greek, in ancient Greek, it tends to be Dionysus. But the parents, of course, will not allow the match. So in grief, she hangs herself, or she otherwise dies of a broken heart, or kills herself, or something. Okay, so there's that motif as well, the denial of one's desire. Okay, and I mean, again, we're talking about this in a mythological, archetypal sense. How that translates into the real world, into laws, into ethics is a big knotty question that I really don't want to get too heavily into here. But it is one of those things that to me makes it not such a cut and dried thing. What is consent and when can you actually give it is a big question. Okay, so that's the one angle. Now, the idea of the virginal girl becoming a woman. So what makes a girl a woman? Well, first of all, she's usually there's body changes. Your body shape changes when you go from girlhood to womanhood. And you usually start menstruating. That's when you have the blood factor. Okay, so there's a motif again that you'll see in folklore and others of the virgin sacrifice, of the girl who's sacrificed on the altar. And again, there's blood involved, and this has to do with the idea of the death of the young girl, who then is sort of reborn into a womanhood. And that's where she might have desire, that's where she might have children. I mean, certainly that was kind of a traditional expectation in a lot of cultures, still is for some people. So there's this idea, and I have to tell you, just if I go back to my own memory of, going from being a girl and to becoming a woman in your mind. And for me, it actually happened. It happened in like a 30-minute time period. It was the weirdest thing, where you literally, it's like, you're still interested in Barbies, and then like an hour later, you're looking at guys, and it's just like, it was just the weirdest transition for me. Maybe that's why I'm a little hung up on it, because it just seems like, wait, what? Like, it is almost like an abduction. It's like your girlhood just disappeared like overnight, and what the F just happened there, And so I guess that's kind of why I tend to feel that it's a very powerful transition. It has a powerful psychological impact, and it has a huge, powerful biological impact as well. And I think, if you're not a woman, if you're a man listening to this, you're not necessarily going to understand that aspect of it. Okay, and not through your own fault. It's just it's one of those things that unless you've experienced it, it can be very, very hard to understand, and it can lead to all kinds of things. It can lead to depression. It can lead to the rebellion. I mean, it's a normal phase of life, but like many phases of life in our culture, we just don't know how to deal with them. That's really the whole point of rituals. Rituals are meant to move you from one phase of life to another, and we don't live in a culture that has any kind of collective myth or ritual. We have parties and things, but there's not really a ritual for moving into manhood or moving into womanhood. Okay, those kinds of things are not, they haven't been part of modern culture. And I think the loss of ritual to a certain degree, or the rituals we have, I'm sorry not to keep going back, but the rituals that we do have they're kind of very watered down. They're very weak versions, so they don't really have the impact of like an initiation. It's not like you're being initiated into the next level for people. It's just become kind of a token thing. And that's kind of a shame, because I feel like we do need to have something to mark the importance of those transitions in a significant way, but we don't really have that in our culture. I want to read a little bit Carl Jung's psychological aspects of the Kore archetype. And he's talking about, of course, this idea of the Kore as she appears in dreams and in folklore and in myth. And he makes this, now he refers to, Demeter, he refers to Persephone and Hecate, he refers to the whole cycle of which are going to be associated with the rites of Eleusis and the mystery cults later on. But the whole journey of Demeter to go find her daughter, and the sort of negotiating to have her return on a cyclical basis. But here's what Jung has to say in this. I'm reading from paragraph 311. If you happen to have collected works 9.1, which I've practically memorized this volume. It's crazy. Okay, so Jung says, as a matter of practical observation, the Kore often appears in woman as an unknown young girl, not infrequently as Gretchen, who's from Faust, okay, it's a reference there, or the unmarried mother. Another frequent modulation is the dancer, who is often formed by borrowings from classical knowledge, in which case the maiden appears as the Corybant, the Maenad, or the nymph, okay, which are all very frenzied, very sexualized, very orgiastic, and sometimes very violent too. Okay. An occasional variant is the Nixie or water sprite, who betrays her superhuman nature by her fishtail. Sometimes the Kore and mother figures slither down altogether to the animal kingdom, the favorite representatives then being the cat or the snake or the bear, or else some black monster of the underworld like crocodile, or other salamander-like saurian creatures. The maiden's helplessness exposes her to all sorts of dangers, for instance being devoured by reptiles or ritually slaughtered like a beast for sacrifice. Often there are bloody, cruel, and even obscene orgies, which the innocent child falls victim. Sometimes it is a true Nakia, which is an underworld journey, a descent into Hades, and a quest for the treasure hard to attain, occasionally connected with orgiastic sexual rites or offerings of menstrual blood to the moon. Oddly enough, the various tortures and obscenities are carried out by an Earth Mother. There are drinkings of blood and bathings in blood and crucifixions. The maiden who crops up in case histories differs not inconsiderably from the vaguely flower-like Kore, and that the modern figure is more sharply delineated and not so unconscious. Okay, so there's where he talks about the archetype, and yeah, to me, this is sort of the Persephone myth for me on another level is that transition into adolescence. Okay, it's the transition from adolescence to adulthood, and it's for girls, like I said, this can have this abduction-like quality, and it can also mean that, and this spouting of desire can make one want to go into places that, the sensible, rational adults would say is dangerous. Whether it's ultimately dangerous or not, I don't know. I suppose it would depend. When women become mothers, then they kind of say, well, I want to protect my daughter. But I don't know how much you can protect, especially when you're at an age when there's a lot of sexual experimentation and so forth. I think about these chastity balls or these things where they get rings where they pledge their virginity. They have like a little ceremony, like a little dance where they wear white dresses, and this is the part that grosses me out. They're pledging their virginity and their chastity to their fathers. At least one of these occasions had the phrase, the Lord is your husband and your father is your boyfriend. Now there's all sorts of things that are wrong with that, because we are not talking about gods, we are talking about human beings here. And these sort of purity rings and chastity balls, I find the whole thing very offensive, because it kind of goes back to the idea, back to when there was kind of a bride price, or when women were marketed like cattle, basically, and her virginity was considered to be something that commanded a higher price. So that's why I'm saying that I am not so bent on purity for teenagers. I mean, yeah, you got to watch out for sexually transmitted disease. You got to be careful of pregnancy. I mean, obviously, you don't want to get involved in these things. You don't want to make lifetime commitments at 14. But by the same token, we're way too locked down, and so then a lot of things happen that we don't want to happen, because people are not properly educated. They don't properly protect themselves. It's just this whole idea that, and the idea that the girl is sort of the property of her father until she's 18 is just, I just find the whole idea that anybody's the property of anybody is disgusting. I understand your parents are responsible for you until you reach a certain age, but I don't, I just feel like a lot of autonomy that one should be developing. Instead, it's just kind of like the stilted, no, you don't ever do this and don't ever do that. And, until you're 18, you're magically, fit for it. So, I don't know, lots to think about there. Okay, the last piece that I want to talk about with this is the idea of the eternal return. And this has to do with Orphism and with the mystery cults. Now, Orphism was a I guess you could call it a religious movement of a kind. I mean, Radcliffe Edmonds had a kind of said that the Orphic movement is kind of like talking about the New Age movement. I mean, you're talking about a variety of different beliefs, not a particular religion per se. Okay, but there is a sort of a collection of beliefs that may come from a variety of sources. A lot of Orphism, they could come out of Far Eastern beliefs. Some of it comes certainly out of Near Eastern beliefs. There are some connections to Zoroastrianism and that kind of thinking. Whether other groups like Judaism or anything else had any influence at that time, I don't really know. I haven't really seen any evidence for that. But Orphism has its own. It's probably, I consider it to be kind of the pre-configuring religious movement that predates, that one of the things that paves the way for Christianity. There's kind of a perfect recipe of things for Christianity. There was the presence of Judaism in the Roman Empire. There's the rule-bound legislative way that Romans manage their own religion. Everything's very, highly regulated and ritualized. And then there's, then you kind of have things like the Orphic beliefs, which are the first ones to put forward kind of an idea of something like salvation. You don't really have what we think of as salvation. There's nothing to be saved from in ancient pagan religion. It's just you're dead. You go to the underworld. That's it. What the Orphics hoped for in the underworld was that they could go to one of the better places. Certainly there's the depths of Tartarus, which only the really, really, really bad people got sent to. And I think they only named like 7 in Greek mythology. There's not that many. And then there's like the Elysian Fields, which are, pretty and pleasant and ruled over by Kronos. And, they're reminiscent of, the pleasantness of life on Earth, where the heroes tend to be transported and so forth. So the idea is that the Orphics is that when they died, they were hoping to, through their series of passwords and initiations, knew how to. They were buried with gold tablets around their necks that had kind of like the passwords for, okay, when you go to the underworld and you encounter this being, you tell them this. It's kind of funny. It's very Egyptian actually, because in Egypt, the soul of the dead, a lot of these hieroglyphs are formulas. The formulas that you need to say to pass through the different gates on the journey of the sun, and because it was kind of akin to that, so that you. Were not, sort of lost forever or thrown off with what their equivalent of demons were. This was the way, and of course you had a certain formula to show that you were righteous in life, whether you really were or not. You just had to be able to say all the right formulas. So Orphism is quite similar in that respect, in that there's a certain formulas or things that you will recite, and that these will it helps remove the fear of death, because if death that you're facing, it's like, oh man, it's just gloomy and people just wander around, and it's like Achilles in the Odyssey when he tells Odysseus, better to be a slave on earth than be a king in the underworld. That it's just so depressing. So this kind of makes things a little less depressing. Now, the Orphics have their own cosmogony. When I say that, this has to do with how the world came into being and how humans came into being in particular. In this one, Zeus and Persephone create Zagreus, or Dionysus. Okay, and Dionysus is said to be the successor of Zeus. Okay, that he's going to be the next king of the gods. Now, this doesn't sound a little bit like Christianity, son of God, son of the king of If you notice that parallel there, it's there. And but the Titans, okay, who there are very jealous because they don't like the idea of this child being able to take over. So they lure him away with toys and things, and then they kill him and they cook him and they eat him, okay? And both Athena and Zeus managed to rescue, and actually Zeus, Athena, and I think Apollo too, they managed to save parts of the baby, particularly his heart. And then they are able to resurrect him. Now, okay, the Son of God who dies and is resurrected. Okay, and again, this happened before the other story, so there's definitely a connection between those stories. It doesn't happen in the same way, but you get the idea. It paves the way for that kind of mythology to take hold in mainstream religion. Let's put it that way. So of course, Zeus, to punish the Titans, he strikes them with his thunderbolt and reduces them to ashes. And out of the ashes come mortals, human beings. And of course, because they've eaten of the flesh of the quote-unquote savior Dionysus, they have a divine spark in them. But because they also have the wicked nature of the Titans, and Plato talks about this, this is where we know that this attitude is there. And so does Olympiodorus. They both kind of talk about the wicked Titan nature, which again, I don't think is supposed to be the original way of looking at the Titans. They're not necessarily wicked. They just tended to be. They lost the war with the Olympians basically, and they tended to be more chaotic and monstrous forces. But that doesn't mean they were evil. But that was the way, of course. Once we get to Plato, now we start throwing ethics into religion and screwing the whole thing up. So in any case, Titans are viewed as wicked, and so that humans have both a wicked and a divine, base and divine nature. Okay. So that's the story. And the idea is, again, this idea of purification, purifying yourself of those wicked elements. They practiced asceticism, they, perhaps even vegetarianism, wore only certain types of clothes. There's different accounts from different places. And the mystery cults, okay, this was the idea that one could be initiated into this cult, and that when one went through the initiation, the mysteries, that basically one's fear of death was removed. We don't know a whole lot about the mysteries. We know there's this, what they call it, the lichnon, or the little, it's like a basket, and that something is kept in the basket, possibly a snake. There's a rite of initiation. There's some images that in villas in Rome, because these mysteries were also popular in Rome, probably fairly late, even after Christianity became a thing and paganism became outlawed. They died out probably shortly thereafter, but the rites still went on. And of course they were secret, which is why nothing's really written about them. But, you kind of get a sense of, it kind of follows a normal initiatory pattern. There's some kind of ordeal that somebody goes through, and where they might be terrified by something, or they might have to face some kind of an arduous task, and then a secret's revealed to them, and then they are sort of, like, it's almost like they're reborn. It's said that the Eleusinian mysteries had three cycles: the cycle of descent, search, and ascent, which mirrors Demeter's search for her daughter Persephone. Okay, there's the descent into the underworld. There's a descent. There's the search for her. In this case, in Demeter's case, with the goddess Hecate, who lights the way in the underworld, and then of course finding her daughter and the ascent back into the upper world. But the mystery becomes sort of a context for this, the idea of the eternal return and a way of getting rid of the fear of death. This is probably also where ideas of metempsychosis and reincarnation found their way into Platonic thinking and into Greek religion. Certainly Plato talks about metempsychosis. The vision of is a little story that he invents about. And of course, this is one that features judgment after death, where souls are judged based on how righteous they were and what kind of a life they led. And then, of course, they're sent, so they're either sent to be punished or they're sent for their reward for a certain number of years. And then they have to come back, draw lots from the fates again, and then they're reborn. That was his idea. Okay, whether this was like a common Greek idea, certainly there are ideas about punishment after death or reward after death. And of course, then where do the punishments take place? In the depths of the earth. And then everything else is kind of moved. Everything's kind of shifted upward to the sky. Even Hades at one point is shifted to the sky. And so we see that the realm of, that the earth, I suppose, and what's under the earth is still considered to be sort of, Plato equated it with what was dense and what was heavy and what weighted you down. And, so it's definitely gets a negative association. Hecate became associated with the sphere of the moon, and of course the sun was associated with the heavens and with the light and with, the lightness of the airy soul that takes off free of all of those, material entanglements. And this is something we kind of take for granted as a means of thinking about the soul and about life after death. But it wasn't always the way it was, and I would not necessarily say it's the best way to look at things. That's at least part of the subject of my book. So I don't want to digress too much into that here. It's easy to do. So the Eleusinian mysteries of Demeter and Persephone, they become sort of the it's interesting how that becomes kind of a precursor to our modern way of thinking about life after death. Okay, and you can take that however you want. I'm not making a value judgment on it. But to me, it is kind of an important change in religious thinking. It may not have been mainstream at first, but then later kind of spreads and becomes mainstream. And between that and sort of philosophers who were devotees of people like Pythagoras, and certainly had a Zoroastrian element to their thinking. Pythagoras seems also very, what's attributed to him also seems very much Zoroastrian or Persian, in its inflection. And again, that's a subject I could go off on, but Zoroastrianism is different because it posits a duality between good and evil. Okay, that there's a battle between good and evil, and this wasn't the case before. You weren't talking about good gods versus evil gods. The gods were all they could be either. They could be very cruel and they could be very kind. It didn't. There wasn't this idea that you've got this wicked faction, this idea of damnation or destroying your soul versus all the good gods and the angels and so forth. That idea comes later, and it's kind of defined modern religion. In my opinion, it's to its detriment. Okay, it's part of the reason why I do this and why I do this podcast is to talk about, what I think is the what I think we kind of need to try to disentangle ourselves from that kind of thinking. Okay, because it has other consequences and side effects that are not good. Okay, that's I think all I'm going to say about Persephone and the story of Persephone. Again, I'd like to thank you for listening. I encourage you to check out Chthonia.net, where not only do you have all the podcasts, but you also have my collections of stories. Stories are coming along. I'm going to tell you that. I have one novel that should be finished by the end of the month, and another one that won't be, the finishing touches won't be done too long thereafter. I got some classes coming up, so definitely check out the website. Also check out metapsychosis.com. We're all our episodes are on metapsychosis.com/series/Chthonia. And I'm also on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Chthonia, excuse me, I can't even talk, as Chthonia Podcast, and same with Twitter. And it's 2 words, I think, on Facebook, Chthonia Podcast, 1 word on the others. And on YouTube, I'm just plain old Chthonia. So you can find me in all those places. And if you would like to help contribute to this effort, that I can spend more time on this and more detail and do some more interesting things, I encourage you, if you're willing to, please donate to my Patreon page, patreon.com/Chthonia. All my current patrons are very much appreciated. Thank you very much. And if you are interested, definitely I'd be very happy to welcome you to my family of patrons who do get certain special things. Occasionally I do special patron-only videos. I have special discounts for patrons on things that I do, on classes, on readings, on things like that. And the patrons also get early preview of, they're the first ones to get access to the podcast, and then they also are the ones who get early access to other writings and things that I have. By virtue of the donation level, which you can check out. Okay, and with that, I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye now.